when we look at the Holocaust, right, you can't look at that just in isolation. The Holocaust was the culmination of centuries of vicious anti-Semitism that prevailed in Europe, that manifested itself in many ways. But if you look at even the Holocaust Museum, they have a very dedicated website where they talk about the long-term issues that led to that explosion of Jewish hate, the otherization of the Jewish community, and the early church, unfortunately, played a big role in it. I won't belabor that. I would encourage people to look up the website and see it for themselves. But that context is important to understand, because the hate that targeted the Jewish community in the Holocaust had a long history in it. You can see, major figures in Christianity like Martin Luther and different churches played a big role in creating and otherizing the Jewish community. Just look at something like the Merchant of Venice play, the famous play by Shakespeare, and how the character of Shylock is portrayed, right? How his business is portrayed as a vicious, blood-sucking business, how him asking to get repaid is portrayed as something weirdly inhuman. These were all tropes that were used to otherize the Jewish community over centuries, and the church played a big role in it. And we need to keep, and coming back to the hooked cross specifically, the hooked cross is a symbol that was found and continues to be found in medieval and old churches in Africa, in the Middle East, and in Europe. And we are sharing a few of these pictures here, whether you look at cathedrals in England, in Mexico, in Ethiopia. The hooked cross was a very powerful symbol that was used over and over again. So where did Hitler get the idea for the hooked cross or the Hakenkreuz from? So this is more of a speculation, but Hitler grew up in the shadow of the Lambach Abbey, and on the walls of the Lambach Abbey is this hooked cross. And this is something that people believe influenced him. And at that time, and as some of our slides show further, German Christians were fully aware of the connections between hooked cross, Hakenkreuz, and the other crosses that were used in Christian iconography, Christian materials, and you can see all of them shown here. And Hitler actually describes in Mein Kampf how he designed that very graphic red on black Hakenkreuz that came to emblemize the Nazi party. But if you look at the excerpt from the Mein Kampf where he talks about it, now you may not know German, I don't too, but you can see very clearly Hitler wrote in German. That was the language he was familiar with. There is no evidence that he knew English or Sanskrit. So he's very clearly writing the word Hakenkreuz. You don't need to know German to see that there's no word swastika in here, but there's multiple references to the word Hakenkreuz. And actually the first translation of Mein Kampf did correctly use the word hooked cross, but unfortunately that one never became popular. And the second translation, which was done by a Catholic priest, James Vincent Murphy, that for some reason translated the Hakenkreuz into the swastika. And that is the translation that then became popular as the World War ended, and that was the start, one of the reasons that this mistranslation became more popular. And again, you have to look at context when you're looking at words and what was prevailing in society at the time. The word Hakenkreuz was not the only word that used the word Kreuz. German literature, German military honors used a bunch of the word Kreuz. There was Christian Kreuz and Ritter Kreuz and Balkan Kreuz and Wilken Kreuz. There was even a military honor that Hitler created called the Ritter Kreuz, and that was given as the largest military honor. It makes sense, right? So if you think about Indian military honors, we say Paramveer Chakra, Shok Chakra, Mahavir Chakra. There is a sequence. You don't just have an odd word dropping in the middle of it all. It would make no sense. It wouldn't motivate the people you're trying to motivate. So anytime you're trying to motivate a population, you will use terms and concepts that they already understand and that they already revere. You won't import a word from halfway across the world in a language that they don't understand and say, oh, this one is going to motivate you, right? So I think people just, if you look at it from a common sense, logical perspective, and you start to see that in this plethora of medals and terminologies and terms. There's no swastika anywhere in Nazi terminology, Nazi materials, Nazi honors. And Nazi literature and Christian church literature at the time used the word Hakenkreuz, and there were actually booklets issued that sort of talked about the complementary role of Nazism in Christianity, of the regular cross with the hooked cross. So there was a lot. And these are the German leaders of the time talking about themselves, not people, historians talking later. And this is not us making up stuff about them. This is literally going to the primary source to see how they talked about themselves. There were lots of books in Germany published at the time that referred to the Hakenkreuz. No books that talked about the swastika. It is just not something that was in their lexicon. And there's a lot of, again, we talked about the historical role of the church in building anti-Semitism, but there is also the role, and more research will happen, I think, in the years to come about the role that the church played or didn't play in stopping the Holocaust as it happened, and there's a lot of historians who are already working on this and who are already sort of trying to see what led to this kind of stuff. But again, there was no Hindu, Buddhist, Jain person out there, motivating the Nazis to do what they did. And I would refer everyone to, there is a wonderful Japanese monk who lives in New York called T.K. Nakagaki. He's written a book about this Hakenkreuz versus swastika difference, calling it Hitler's symbol. And he has speculated, and more research is needed in the area, but he has basically said, who could have benefited from the translation of turning a Hakenkreuz into swastika? And he basically speculates that, maybe there was some interplay going on. Remember, World War II was a fight between two sets of primarily Christian powers. And so probably, and there are actually some American army booklets from that time given to soldiers saying, hey, as you go into the countryside, this is how you distinguish between a cross and a Nazi cross. So there was already some talk happening, but so it may be a little thinking about who benefited really from disassociating the word Kreuz from the horrors of the Holocaust that were later discussed. And so, more research needed in that place. That's not what we really go into. We want to basically talk about how this corruption of the word happened and why we today need to care about it. So there was a time when the world, even the Western world, called the Hakenkreuz a Hakenkreuz. And before we go into that, one of the folks who actually warned against the corruption of this word is somebody who I know is not very popular in dharmic circles otherwise. But Max Mueller actually warned against people using the word swastika outside India, because something that led to the popularity of the symbol in Europe was the discovery of this symbol in Grecian digs that were happening at the end of the 19th century. So they discovered the symbol. They saw people in India and various parts of Asia were calling the similar looking symbol swastika, and so many in Europe started using it, which was the designs I had shown earlier, the good luck token, the football team, etc. But as that happened, Max Mueller warned people that saying, really the usage of the word swastika should be limited to the dharmic phase, because it's a very specific, auspicious meaning related to it, and there can be a lot of potential for mischief if we just start using these terms out of context, which is really what was happening when Coca-Cola was issuing a token with that symbol on it, or a football team was putting it. They were not calling it, they didn't have the dharmic, swastika in their mind. They were just like, it looks cool, here's the term, we'll use it, which I think speaks to the danger of cultural appropriation, all that we talk about nowadays, and that was an early example. But there was a time when even the West the Hakenkreuz correctly as the Hakenkreuz. So, the rise of Hitler is well documented. And let's look at what 100 years ago the New York Times was calling his symbol when they were reporting on the rise of it. This article is from 1922. And it quite clearly talks about the rise of Hitler and his followers, who New York Times calls the Hakenkreuzlers, not the swastikaers or swastika followers or anything, calls them the Hakenkreuzlers. So this was a term that was well accepted in journalism in those times. You can see the Jewish Daily Bulletin doing the same, talking about documenting the rising atrocities against Jewish people in different parts of Europe, but constantly referring to the symbol as Hakenkreuz, not swastika. And Nazis were avid propagandists themselves. I mean, they published their own literature, they published their own newspapers. Guess what they called their newspapers? Not the swastika banner, but the Hakenkreuz banners. And so I think you have to, you have to take people for their words. And if they are calling their symbol the Hakenkreuz, there really is no reason to be saying, no, they actually meant it to be the swastika. You can see that even as late as 1934, the New York Times was still calling Hitler's symbol as Hakenkreuz. But New York Times, like in many other cases, has played an infamous role in driving this narrative change, because in 1933, for the first time, contradicting their own reporting from earlier years, they started calling Hitler's symbol swastika. And they also came up with this big article about, an old symbol, the hooked cross, making its way from India into Germany. Very illogical kind of argument, because India didn't have a hooked cross. India had a swastika. Hooked cross was in Europe, and hooked cross was right there in Germany. Germany did not need to import hooked crosses from India. It had it right there on its own abbeys and churches. But this was the first time we see New York Times use the word swastika to describe Hitler's symbol, contradicting its own reporting from 1920s. And also, as I showed in the previous thing, right? Even in 1934, when they reported, they still by mistake used Hakenkreuz, which happens because, if you are in a job and your boss suddenly changes the terminology on you, you will use it, but sometimes you might lapse into old terminology. And all of these snapshots that I'm showing, these are actually, if you go to our website, kohna.org/swastika, you will find a link to a page where we link to New York Times archival articles. So these are not just snapshots that you can accuse us of doctoring or photoshopping. If you have a New York Times subscription, you will actually find those articles still up on New York Times websites. So people can say there's a lot of history, who cares what happened. Today it's called, the swastika, and we hear that in the West a lot. When we explain the history, and they're like, well, fine. But now it's been taken over, too bad, you can't get it back. So to that, we have to say, look, that's not true. We never lost it because Hitler never used the term. So there's no taking back the swastika. Hitler never used it. We never lost the term, and we never stopped using the term. What you guys did was you started using a term that he never did. And really, in terms of historical accuracy, it was the Hakenkreuz that oversaw the horrors of the Holocaust, not the swastika. Was Hitler inspired by Indian or Hindu symbols? Did he really use the swastika? Even if he called it the Hakenkreuz, did he use it because he saw it in India? Well, people can speculate what they want, but the evidence is quite contrary. We've shown the widespread usage of the hooked cross where he was growing up, but also Hitler was no fan of India, and there's plenty of speeches where he has made his hate for Indians quite clear. And that makes sense. Hitler hated the brown races. He was all about the superiority of the white Aryan race. Why would he be wanting to take a symbol that was sacred to a bunch of brown people halfway across the world? In fact, even though he was at war with the British, he thought that it was good, because there's a lot of quotations out about Hitler and what he's thought about Indians, and how he thought that, despite his enmity with the British, it was good that the British were ruling the brown savages of India.